Thank you very much, Chairman Flake and Senator Udall and all the members of your subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today and for all of your attention on this issue. We greatly appreciate your efforts. World Wildlife Fund is the largest private conservation organization working internationally to protect wildlife and wildlife habitats, and we currently sponsor programs in more than 100 countries. I won't repeat points made by some of our previous witnesses, particularly with respect to elephants, but what I would like to do is touch briefly on the situation related to African rhinos and focus on the needs and potential solutions as related to community-based conservation, anti-trafficking measures, and reducing demand. I'll talk about a couple of examples from Southern Africa. Let me first reference your comment, Mr. Chairman, earlier about the seriousness of this issue that we're dealing with. We're talking about transnational organized crime as applied to wildlife, and to that end, WWF strongly encourages support for the legislation currently pending in both houses, S-27, introduced by Senators Feinstein and Graham, and H.R. 2494, introduced by Representatives Royce and Ingle. These bills would make large-scale wildlife trafficking a predicate offense to other major crimes such as money laundering, racketeering, and smuggling, and provide critical tools for enforcement that are available now for other big crimes that we also need applied to wildlife. So we're very encouraged to see this legislation being considered. Regarding rhino poaching, over the 50 years or so that WWF has been involved in rhino conservation, we've seen great strides in both the recovery of rhinos, both black and white rhinos in Africa, as well as periods of severe poaching. Today, 4 countries hold the key to the black rhino's future in many respects: Namibia, Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. And for the white rhino, it's South Africa. However, the continued recovery of these populations and the survival of rhinos in other parts of Africa is now in doubt in many respects because of the recent resurgence in trade and demand. These days, all eyes are on South Africa, where we've seen a massive increase in poaching over the last 7 years. The statistics are well known. From 13 rhinos poached in 2007 to over 1,200 in 2014. And according to information we received earlier this week, 2015 is on track to be the worst year yet for rhinos. Current research in South Africa, supported by WWF, is finding strong evidence that rhino horn trafficking is controlled by sophisticated organized crime groups that are involved in smuggling both people and narcotics, with operations firmly embedded within South Africa. In the last 3 years or so, tens of millions of dollars, including from generous supporters in the U.S., including the U.S. government, have been contributed to the South African government and other key stakeholders in the country, and yet the poaching and trafficking problem is getting worse. We're highly concerned about the persistent allegations of serious levels of corruption there that occur hand in hand with these organized crime activities. It is our view that until the South African government addresses these issues on a sufficient scale, that nothing is going to change. So we see this as a high priority, and we encourage this committee to use its influence to press the South African government to do more and to help where we can as a country. Turning to the next door to South Africa, Namibia. Namibia is currently the continent's stronghold for black rhino, and the country is, in many ways, a great example of how wildlife resources, if properly conserved, can form the basis for both economic growth in impoverished regions and effective conservation. The community-run conservancies in Namibia are an effective model, thanks in part to generous support over many years from USAID and more recently the Millennium Challenge Corporation, working with WWF and other local partners. In these conservancies, much as you've heard from other witnesses and other countries, local communities own, manage, and profit from their own wildlife resources, which has contributed to rebounding wildlife population as well as increased economic benefits for local people. Until recently, Namibia's rhino and elephant populations have been largely immune to poaching, but unfortunately, the wave of poaching that is sweeping Africa is finally hitting Namibia. About 70 rhinos have been poached this year, nearly all in the western part of the Tosha National Park. In just the last 3 weeks, though, we're encouraged that over 30 arrests have been made, mainly of low-level government officials. So Namibia's got its own internal problem, but they seem to be taking action through a no-tolerance for poaching approach that the country has taken on. The next key step for Namibia is to ensure that the judiciary prosecutes these crimes in a serious manner, and we're working to help them ensure that they have a dedicated wildlife prosecution specialist established. So when it comes down to it, one of the reasons Namibia has been successful, reflecting some of the comments made by other witnesses in other countries, many of the arrests have been achieved through information provided from community intelligence and informer networks, which are then passed on to enforcement officials. I'll just mention briefly an example in Asia, where we've also seen actually success in keeping poaching under control. The country of Nepal, similarly, strongly focused on community-based conservation with strong support for enforcement from highest levels of government, has resulted in 3 of the last 5 years, 0 poaching of rhinos, elephants, and tigers in Nepal. And so it's just another example of what can be effective. Let me just briefly mention that we're not going to address this issue successfully unless we really disrupt these transnational organized crime syndicates. And to that end, it's critical to see enhanced intelligence and information systems not only within these countries but across countries, across borders. We do not yet have sort of proactive intelligence collection systems that are integrated across borders that will allow us to direct more strategically enforcement efforts. And so that's an area that we see as a weakness that could be remedied by training, support from the U.S. for training, provision of intelligence analysis software, and additional resources that would allow enforcement staff to allocate more strategic focus on the areas that are the biggest problems. I know this is a priority for the State Department and the Fish and Wildlife Service. We urge continued support for these activities, and we feel they're strongly needed. Last point I'll make very briefly, previous witness touched on this as well, stopping demand is obviously critical. Of the 3 areas that are critical for action in this, on this whole issue, anti-poaching, anti-trafficking, and demand reduction. Demand reduction has received by far the least investment over the years, so we see a real need to emphasize that more. We're encouraged by recent news from China as the big driver, encouraged by the news that they are committed to limiting their ivory market. But we haven't seen that action yet, and it will be influenced by what the U.S. does as well for its own ivory market. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to any questions.